previous lesson, we tried to understand why Napoleon fell from power. This is because Napoleon had tried to unify all the major European nations so that together they can defeat Britain. But in the process of waging war against Russia, Napoleon had lost a lot of soldiers, and slowly this was paving the way for his downfall, for a loss of his popularity. He was declining in popularity, and then he was exiled following his defeat. So in the previous lesson, we discussed how Napoleon was left alone to die in the island of St. Helena, which is in South Atlantic Ocean. Now, do you think with the fall of Napoleon, nationalistic sentiments also came to an end in France? That is, did people now stop believing in the spirit of nationalism? Now, you must remember that after the defeat and fall of Napoleon, that is, after he ceased to be the Emperor of France, the erstwhile monarchy was again reinstituted in France. So, it was the erstwhile, the former French monarchy that was ruling France all over again. Now, you must be thinking that with this, we followed a circular journey. That is, we came back to where we began. Before the French Revolution, it was the French monarchy that was ruling France, and then the revolution took place. Subsequently, republican governments came to place. Then, under the leadership of Napoleon, a consulate government, and then the empire of Napoleon was also in place in France. Napoleon soon went on to becoming the master of Europe. Now, after the fall of Napoleon, we are again coming back to where we started. That is, France is now again having the former monarchical rule. Through this, many people and many historians continue to believe that it was Napoleon who was a deterrent to nationalism. That is, he was hindering, he was impeding the growth of nationalism. Why is it so? Because the French Revolution was intended to overthrow the monarchy, the French Empire. And it was Napoleon himself who again put in place of those republican governments another empire. So people started believing that Napoleon tried to hinder the growth of the spirit of nationalism among the people of France. But if we leave it at this point, it will be a grave error on our part, because Napoleon's empire was not similar to the erstwhile French monarchy. This is because despite establishing a monarchy, Napoleon carried forward the ideas of the French Revolution itself. Napoleon can be considered an offspring of the French Revolution because he was inspired by the ideals of liberty, equality and fraternity. It is for this reason that he had also gained huge popularity among the masses. Now, the empire that was formed under the leadership of Napoleon was very different from what was in place before the outbreak of the French Revolution. That French monarchy was founded on privileges, on feudalism, on social classes, on differences and hierarchy among the people of France. But Napoleon's empire was very different because he was inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution. And it is through his empire that he also spread these ideals to the various places he conquered. Now this brings us to another point. Which are the places he conquered, or to put it simply, which are the places that were inspired by Napoleon's ideals of an empire? The former empires that were prevalent not just in France but throughout the continent of Europe hindered the growth of nationalism. In fact, the interests of those empires went against the spirit of nationalism because those empires wanted monarchy to be ruling over the people of those countries. So this was very different from nationalistic sentiments that demanded that real power should be in the hands of the people. Now, contrary to what we have been discussing was Napoleon's empire. We have already discussed that Napoleon's empire was inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution. So, Napoleon's empire gave Europe a sense of unity. This sense of unity was not existent before Napoleon's empire was formed, because in the erstwhile empires, people were divided on the basis of the social classes they belonged to, divided on the basis of religion. But owing to the ideas and the ideologies that came into being after the French Revolution, Napoleon's empire was very liberal in nature. Napoleon's empire was not founded on privileges and traditional ideas. So, Napoleon's empire gave people a sense of unity. Now, whenever these ideals of liberty, equality and fraternity spread to other parts of the continent of Europe through Napoleon's rule, these people now got a sense of unity, a sense of belongingness to the country where they lived. This was not in play before the ideals of the French Revolution spread to those countries. The point we have been trying to establish all this while is that Napoleon's empire was very different, was very contradictory to the erstwhile empires. So, through his empire, he gave people a sense of belonging. People were now feeling that they were closely tied within one community. They belonged to one nation, and this gave birth in them the spirit of nationalism. That is, I belong to the country where I live. You and I must also feel this kind of a sentiment for the country we live in, that is India. And it is this nationalistic sentiment that Napoleon gave rise to in the minds of people in not just France but throughout Europe. On this map, you can see several territories are marked in different colors. Now let me explain this map to you. The territories that are marked in blue, that is this place, show you the French Empire. So this was the Empire of France under the rule of Napoleon. The territories on the map that are marked in green show you the states that were under Napoleon's direct control, that is these areas. In these areas as well, Napoleon's ideals, the ideals of the French Revolution, along with nationalistic sentiments had also spread. Following this, we have certain territories that are marked in purple. These were states that were allied with Napoleon. So, these empires, that is Prussia and Austrian Empire, were friends of France. And the areas that are marked in orange in the map show you the states that were against Napoleon. Few of such states would be United Kingdom, Portugal. Now with this you can understand that the Empire of France or the French Empire was directly under Napoleon's control. Simultaneously with that, few states that are marked in green were also under the control of France, and the states that were allied with Napoleon were also inspired by his ideals. So together these places were inspired by the nationalistic sentiments that came into being after the French Revolution. Now it is imperative on our part to find out what was happening in these places after the fall of Napoleon. That is, Napoleon was formerly in charge or in power over these places. Now what happened after Napoleon fell out of power and died? What was happening in these states? Their interests were already with Napoleon, and in the minds of the people who were living in these states, were infused sentiments of nationalism. Now, what did this give rise to? After the fall of Napoleon, these newly united people, united on the grounds of shared ideals, common aspirations, on the grounds of nationalistic sentiments, these people now led their own nationalistic fight. What were these people doing? These people were now crying out in protest, in rebellion, to gain independence for their nations, to gain freedom for their nations. These people no longer wanted to be under the control of any foreign rule, which is why the nationalistic sentiments that had begun growing in their minds were now taking shape of nationalistic fights. These people were now wanting to have independent nations of their own. Now, these nationalistic fights were not restricted to France alone. These nationalistic movements spread across the entire continent of Europe. Few of such countries which were very much inspired by these nationalistic sentiments and these nationalistic movements would be Poland, Greece, Germany and Italy. This we will come to later, as in what was happening in these countries. Poland was among the nations that were inspired by the nationalistic sentiments. Here you can see Polish people wanting independence and freedom from the Russian Empire. So, Poland was also waging its own nationalistic movements. It was wanting to form its own independent nation. Simultaneously, we can also see that in Greece, this idea of nationalism played a major role. What role did nationalism play in this? The people of Greece were also heavily inspired by the spirit of nationalism, which is why they tried to overthrow the Ottoman Empire and bring into being the independent nation of Greece. So now you must have understood how important was the ideas that spread through Napoleon's empire. Napoleon was in no way a traditional monarch, a traditional empire who wanted to shield his own bastion of privileges. Napoleon was not such a ruler. Instead, it was on account of Napoleon's rule that nationalistic sentiments, the ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity, the hunger for freedom and independence had spread to many countries throughout the continent of Europe, and with this came into being many modern independent nations. With this in mind, we will now try to understand what happened in particular in Germany and Italy, as in how these nations got their independence. Among the nations we just talked about, Germany was one such country that was heavily inspired by the ideas of nationalism. Now, when Napoleon was in power, he had formed a confederate of the northern German states. Germany, as the nation we know it today, that is one independent country, wasn't in existence before the 18th century. So, very small kingdoms, small territories together made up Germany. Now, when these nationalistic ideas and this sentiment spread among the masses, they also wanted to have their own independent nation. It is under the leadership of Prussia that the German unification took place. What happened in this? After the fall of Napoleon, this nationalistic movement rose up in the Germanic states and kingdoms. The former Prussian Prime Minister Otto von Bismarck, this person spearheaded this nationalistic movement, and it is under his leadership that the separate Germanic states, these kingdoms together came and united as the single German Empire in the year 1871. So the formation of this German Empire in 1871 was a direct continuation of Napoleon's ideals of the French Revolution, because he gave these people the hope of seeing their own independent nation, and this together led to this German unification. So in the year 1871 now came into being this single German Empire. It was a consolidated empire because the former Germanic states and kingdoms that were spread throughout this region now together unified to form a single empire. Before we get into discussing what was happening in Italy during this period, let me ask you a question. When did this German unification occur? Was it in 1870, 1871, 1872 or 1873? Yes, you are right. It was in 1871 that this German unification took place. And with this, the first chancellor of this German empire was Otto von Bismarck. He was the leader of this nationalistic movement. Formerly, he was the Prime Minister of Prussia, and after the formation of the German Empire in 1871, he now became the first Chancellor of this empire. 19th century Europe was witness to a similar thing happening in Italy as well. We learned how the German unification took place in 1871. Now, while the French Revolution was being waged, or while Napoleon was in power, Italy too wasn't a single state. Italy wasn't a single independent nation. It was made up of certain territories, certain kingdoms that together fell in the Italian peninsula. Now, some of these regions were under the control of Napoleon, which explains why the nationalistic sentiments spread to this area as well. And now, after the fall of Napoleon, these people of Italy too wanted to have their own independent nation. This is very similar to what was happening in Germany. Now, the people of Italy were also wanting their independent nation. So, this nationalistic movement rose up in the kingdoms and principalities that together made up the Italian peninsula. What did this lead to? This led to their unification into the single state of Italy in the year 1871. Now it was in 1871 only when the German unification took place. And in the same year, this Italian unification also took place. Italian nationalists were demanding unification, following which this unification took place in the year 1871. The leaders Mazzini, Cavour and Garibaldi were spearheading this movement. So, it is under their leadership that this Italian unification took place and came into being the single state of Italy that you and I know today. With this, we again come back from continental Europe to France. We have already traced the trajectory of Napoleon's rise to power, his rule and his decline. Now, following this was restored in France the old French monarchy. Now, do you think this restoration of the old monarchy put an end to all kinds of nationalistic movements? Did it wipe away the spirit of nationalism from the minds of the people? Never so. This is because following the French Revolution, the masses of France had already tasted independence. They knew how life could be without the impositions of monarchical rule, which is why these nationalistic sentiments did not wither away from their minds. So, despite the old monarchy was restored in France following the death of Napoleon, another major revolution took place in 1830. In this year, the monarchy that was reinstalled was again overthrown. The masses of France, the public, led this revolution in 1830, with which they overthrew that French monarchy. Now, with the overthrowing of this French monarchy in 1830, came into being another new liberal monarchy. Soon enough, the people of France realized that this new monarchy, this new liberal monarchy, was of no good either. This is because this monarchy was also founded on corruption, on privileges, which is why it never took into consideration the masses. It never cared for the masses' demands and requirements. So subsequently, in the year 1848, the people of France led another revolution to overthrow this new liberal monarchy. At this point, the people of France knew that they will not settle for anything less than a republican government. So, the French Revolution had already sealed the fate of French monarchy. The French Revolution gave birth in the minds of the people ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity. This is a point that we have been discussing in all our lessons. Now, even after this monarchy was restored, people did not want this monarchy. They wanted to have a liberal government, a republican government. So, these revolutions of 1830 and 1848 were the logical repercussions of the restoration of the French monarchy. Following these two revolutions in 1830 and 1848, the people of France now established the Republic of France. So, France was now finally a republic and they ended monarchy. Monarchy was ended and came into being the Republic of France. This was a fulfillment for the revolutionaries. This was the final culmination point of the French Revolution. This was the victory of the ideals of liberty, equality and fraternity. This was the final end of monarchical rule. And with this came into being the Republic of France. The fall of Napoleon did not put an end to these nationalistic movements that were spreading throughout the globe. The spirit of nationalism, the democratic ideals, the ideologies of liberty, equality and fraternity were not restricted to one country, were not restricted to one continent either. These ideas now spread across the globe. These ideas together gave birth to many modern independent nations. The period that came following the fall of Napoleon and before the 20th century is also known as the Age of Nationalism. Why is this age of any significance to us? This is because during this period, that is, during this age of nationalism, so many modern nations took birth. So, this age of nationalism constitutes a very important epoch in the history of the world. If you notice this pictorial illustration very closely, you will find that the flags of the United States of America and France have already crossed this statue. That means that these countries have already been successful in gaining independence. These countries have now become independent nations, and so many countries are now following their lead. So many people with their flags are now following their lead. They are marching on the way to their final independence. They are marching on the way to freedom. So, this age of nationalism is very crucial to us. And as all these people are moving towards freedom, are moving towards forming their independent nations, you will see that the gods are giving them blessing. It was as if the gods were giving them blessing so that they can form their independent nations. Now these very ideas of nationalism, of democracy, of liberty came into being from the French Revolution. This tells you how important the French Revolution, or for that matter the American War of Independence were, because these were major political expressions of nationalism. With this, we come to an end of our discussion on nationalism. Now, while trying to understand nationalism, we traced the background, the roots of nationalism. But we weren't restricted to understanding only the roots of nationalism, and it is for this reason that we took into account two major political expressions of nationalism, that were the American War of Independence and the French Revolution. We delved into these two events in history in great depth. We were trying to understand the ideas, the various reasons that together contributed to the outbreak of these revolutions, so that we can understand these events in history with greater clarity. Now, after understanding the American War of Independence and the French Revolution, we also saw what was happening in Europe during the rule of Napoleon. Napoleon, though eventually defeated by Britain and other European powers, cannot be ignored when we come to the history of the 18th century Europe. This is because it was under his leadership that France rose heights. France gained prominence in the continental politics of Europe. France became a major power only under the leadership of Napoleon. We also tried to understand what happened in France and in other parts of the continent after the fall of Napoleon. This brought us to a discussion on the formation or the birth of many nation states, two of which would be Germany and Italy. The spirit of nationalism continued well beyond the 18th century into the 20th century, because it was in 20th century that the country we live in, that is India, gained its independence. So this one spirit of nationalism together with patriotism has been very, very important in the formation of independent nations, and these together constitute the ideas that we have been discussing in this series of lessons. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.